ocean ice and sea ice fluxes and air-sea exchange. So something fun and something a little bit I'm hoping to learn a bit about too. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Brian Butterworth, who is showed up 2 weeks ago, I think on the coldest day we've had this winter. So it's a nice introduction. So Brian's going to be with us for a couple years, hopefully. So he's joining my lab as a postdoc, working on my northern Wisconsin field experiment, where we are deploying a large amount of instruments, and Brian is going to be, in many ways, a jack of many trades and instruments. And when I was interviewing him, I learned that his background has been on doing eddy flux measurements in even more challenging conditions off of ships in the Southern Ocean and also up in northern Canada. I said, well, that sounds good. You want a harder challenge? How about mosquito-ridden northern woods? So he jumped at the chance to come up here to Wisconsin and join my lab. Just to give you a little bit of background, so Brian got his bachelor's degree at the University of Delaware in environmental sciences and a master's in geography at CU Boulder. He then did his PhD at Albany in meteorology, right?
Yeah, atmospheric.
Atmospheric sciences. Okay, yeah. And your advisor was
Scott Miller.
Scott Miller. Okay, so somebody who does a lot of air lake fluxes as well. And I think you'll be hearing a bit about your dissertation research in this talk about ship and tower-based or air-sea carbon dioxide exchange in the Southern Ocean and the Antarctic sea ice zone. And then after he got his PhD, he went over to the University of Calgary as a postdoc, working on further on ship-based eddy covariance measurements in the Arctic. And so it's my pleasure. I look forward to having Brian here in the lab, along with a number of other staff who will be joining us to work on this experiment next summer. But definitely, Brian's office is up on 15. Please go say hi to him, along with the rest of 15 is changing. You won't believe it, because there's lots of people coming and lots of people moving around. So come up to 15. It's a really cool floor now. But with that, without further ado, I'll leave it to Brian to talk about air-sea carbon dioxide exchange in the Southern Ocean and Antarctic sea ice.
Thank you. Yeah. All right. So, as Ankur said, I'm gonna lay out I'll show you today what I did as part of my PhD work, and then so that's this project, and then at the very end I'll just do a brief update on what the last year or two have been in Canada. But this one is about CO2 fluxes that were made aboard a ship in the Southern Ocean, and the project was designed to be a long-term CO2 flux experiment. So it's eddy covariance measurements taken from the bow mast of this ship, and it was designed to be an unattended system. So it ran on this ship for 9 cruises over 18 months, and only one of the cruises was anybody from our lab on it. So after that first cruise, I rode with it. The next 8, it was by itself. So yeah, so the idea was to measure CO2 fluxes in the Southern Ocean. And kind of the reason behind that is the ocean is an important sink for CO2 fluxes, kind of on a global scale. So a lot of estimates say it's about uptakes about 1/4 of anthropogenic CO2 globally. So this map here just shows that there's a distribution of where there are large fluxes, and also where fluxes go into and where they go out of the ocean. So this is a modeled result, and you can see around the equator you've got outgassing, so the reds and the yellows, and then as you move north and south to more mid-latitudes and polar regions, you have net uptake. So the question, and that's the blues and the purples here. And so another way to look at this, this is just a plot of the same data set here, cut off. This is from Takahashi et al. 2002. And essentially what you can see is, so this is latitude on the y-axis, CO2 flux, band average CO2 flux on the x-axis, and you can see where the sinks are, mid-latitudes, and in the north, north and south, and then in the equator you've got a source. So when you see something like this, a plot like this, a map like this, these are CO2 fluxes calculated using a bulk formula for CO2 flux. So that bulk formula is at the bottom here, where FC is the CO2 flux, and that's set to be equal to K, which is the gas transfer velocity. It's a transfer coefficient that describes the efficiency of gas exchange across the air-water interface, multiplied by S, which is the solubility of CO2 in seawater, and then delta P CO2. And that is the difference between partial pressure of CO2 in the atmosphere and in the water. So that delta P CO2 term is what distinguishes the direction of the flux. So somewhere where you have really low P CO2 in the water, like the Southern Ocean or the North Atlantic, you will have net uptake. So CO2 will go from the atmosphere into the water. And then reverse in the equatorial Pacific, you have high PCO2 values in the water and the outgases. So what we were after on this project was K, the gas transfer velocity. And that's typically, or almost always, not always, but almost always parameterized as a function of 10-meter wind speed. That's mostly out of convenience, but it is affected by the wind speed. So you're going to get more gas exchange where you have higher winds. Yep.
Brian, is the diffusivity coefficient a function of the PCO2 difference? Or
So everything involved with the physics of the gas exchanges is incorporated into K.
Oh,
So
okay.
So that's, at least in theory, everything, the delta PCO2 only drives the direction, and it will still drive the quantity of the flux, but the actual physical parameters that are affecting the flux are all incorporated in K.
Okay.
So that's the reason why using only 10-meter wind speed isn't really appropriate. But you'll see that the data sets, like Eddy covariance, it's difficult. It's a kind of a noisy data set, so it's hard to get at all the little pieces and pull them apart. So in the future, that's people's goal.
Okay.
But
Another question.
yeah.
I understand the sign of the flux over most of the map, but in the northern Pacific,
Yeah.
it's positive, which is a little unexpected. What's going on there?
I don't know that actual question, but so specifically there, I don't know why it is, but it may be similar to what you have in the Southern Ocean. You would have, there's sea ice for part of the year. I don't actually know what that region of the North Pacific looks like, but in the Southern Ocean, what you have is you have sea ice coverage for part of the year, and then and so you have actually both signs both directions. So when the sea ice retreats, I believe it's uptake, and then there's outgassing later in the year. So it could be that you've got this balancing act going on with the sea ice.
So it follows
But-
the seasonal effect.
Seasonal effect. But I actually don't know specifically for that region. Yeah. But yeah, just to say that these are net over the year. So yeah, so you may often have uptake, but you could sometimes have outgassing. So this plot just shows K versus U parameterizations. These are some really common ones. So Liston-Merlevat was a piecewise linear function that was found using a deliberate dual tracer experiment. And that experiment had a spatial and temporal resolution of days to hundreds of kilometers. Then this other one, the blue one, is Monikoff 2014. That was found using a geochemical tracer method. So for that, they use inventories of C14, which is an isotope of carbon, and they measured it over the course of the degradation over the course of years. So essentially, and that C14 came from nuclear bomb experiments in the 50s, and so they've measured how it's changed over decades, and so they get an average CO2 uptake by the ocean, and they use it. They use the distribution for wind speeds over the ocean, and they come up with this curve, and essentially that's just a curve that's drawn through one point in the origin, and they just chose a quadratic form for it. But this is a really highly cited. This is actually the most cited parameterization in the literature. Well, not the 2014 because it's new, but it's based off of the 92, which is kind of like the original. Yep.
Isn't that the base of like every climate model's air-sea exchange parameter?
Yeah,
Just that
it's
equation.
by like far and away the most commonly used. So there's so kind of the issue here, and so several decades ago, people said, well, these scales, that's even broader scale, like a coarser scale than this one. They said, well, these are not scales where we can actually get at the physical processes affecting gas exchange. So people went out just to measure using Eddy covariance, and so this is one of the more famous ones of Eddy covariance. This is Wanikoff and McGillis, 1999, from the Gas X 98 cruise in the North Atlantic. And they saw reasonable agreement with the other parameterizations at low wind speed, and then at higher wind speeds it diverges really wildly. And what they said here, like their prediction or their interpretation of this was that white caps and bubbles at the high wind speeds enhance gas exchange. But one issue with that is that there really aren't a lot of data points. So they only had a handful of data points out there. So it wasn't really well constrained. And then more recently, and part of the reason for going out to do this project is several papers over the last decade came out saying the methods that were used for eddy covariance over the ocean had an instrumental flaw. And so there's not really a lot of confidence in pretty much anything that happened 20 years ago. So we went out to try and kind of essentially recreate this, like go get some eddy covariance data to try and to see what we could find using eddy covariance data for this K versus U parameterization. And the reason that matters is if you do plug it into a carbon budget, like an equation using the Bolt formula. So this, cut off again. This is the Wanacott and McGillis 1999 paper. They calculated global carbon budget using a quadratic and using a cubic. So this is flux on the y-axis, average per latitude band, and then latitude on the y-axis. And you can see the open squares, which is the middle line here. That's the quadratic one, and then the lower one, the filled-in squares, is using a cubic parameterization. And what they found is they got 60% greater uptake if they use this cubic parameterization over quadratic. So it's obviously it's going to play a really big role in what you're predicting for global carbon uptake from the ocean. So the question we set out, the first question was, what is the dependence of K on wind speed in the open water? And part of the reason for going to the Southern Ocean is the Southern Ocean is a really windy place. It also generally has really low delta P CO2, which is good for measuring CO2 flux. So we were trying to get more data points at that high wind speed area. And then the other part of the project was, let's make this thing unattended and get as many cruises as we possibly can measure. So almost always eddy covariance had been done on a ship-by-ship basis. Like you rode with your equipment, you were on the ship for a month to 2 months, and then you removed it. And you might only have a day or two where you got any high winds, so you wouldn't get a lot of points. So the idea was to collect as many high wind speed points as we could. But then, because we were on a polar ship and it was in the sea ice zone frequently, we were capable of asking a second question, which nobody had been able to address before. And it wasn't our main priority, but it ended up being kind of a secondary focus, which was, what is the effect of sea ice on gas exchange? So, and while the ship was collecting data, while we were collecting data on the ship, this parameter model came out meant for air sea ice gas exchange. So one of the other parts of my PhD research became testing the model and seeing how it related to what we ended up measuring. And that model used a wind speed-based formulation, but it also added in a shear and buoyancy component from like a surface renewal model. And what they predicted was that because the sea ice was going to create additional types of turbulence from form drag and buoyancy effects from salt expulsion or freezing, that the added waterside turbulence was going to increase gas exchange in the open water areas, which wasn't wildly off of what some people had measured in the sea ice zone before. So there had been predictions that, okay, we get really enhanced gas exchange through the leads in the sea ice. So the question was for us to test this, and it ran off of pretty much basic meteorological variables. So we were capable of testing it. So I'll just lay this out here as what I'm going to talk about. I'll start with the methods. I'll show you the cruise ship tracks. Then I'll lay out the results for the open water, then for the sea ice. Then I'll show you the carbon budget that we calculated using those results. And then after the conclusions, I'll just show you those pictures of the next project. Okay, so this was the ship. This is the Nathaniel B. Palmer. It's a U.S. Research vessel and an icebreaker. It's about 100 meters long, give or take. So it's not huge, but it's not too small either. And then so our stuff was mounted in several places. The majority, or kind of like the main pieces, were on the bow mast and just below the bow mast under the deck in the bosun's locker. And then we also had cameras on the ice tower, and there were some 2D anemometers on the science tower in the back. And so the method, the Eddy covariance method for measuring CO2 flux, I've got the equation at the top. So that's CO2 flux, FC, is equal to the mean air density times the covariance between fluctuations in vertical winds, so that's W prime, and fluctuations in CO2 mixing ratio, so C prime. So it's in theory it's a pretty simple. It's more difficult to actually measure it, but it's pretty straightforward, and it represents a direct measurement of the flux. And a way to think about it in layman's terms is just you're measuring at a really high frequency, and if on average updrafts have more CO2 in them than downdrafts, you have an upward flux.
If you have a wind from the stern, do you sometimes get contamination?
Yeah, we had to throw out anything from behind. In fact, we had a pretty narrow window, so the ship hull created some distortion, and this picture is not fine enough that you can see it, but when this picture was taken, we only had 2 anemometers. We ended up putting more on there to measure, see when and what flow distortion looked like. And so we ended up only using plus or minus 45 degrees of head-on. So yeah, we had to throw out a lot of data.
It doesn't look like the sonics are very far out. So.
No, they're not, and it would have been preferable to have them farther out.
Just kind of thinking about the potential flow distortion effects.
Yeah, or higher up. But both things just weren't capable. We tried, and we got shot down. So it was apparently a safety issue or something to that effect. So, so that's how you would measure the CO2 flux in theory. And then the way we actually do it, the instrumentation is we have 2 3-dimensional sonic anemometers on the bow mast. So that's this picture here. These guys with the claws. And then we also had 2 motion sensors, which were used to motion correct the winds for the ship motion. That was a bigger deal in the high seas, like when the waves were large. When we were in the sea ice, the ship really doesn't move much at all because there's no waves. But we motion correct everything. And then below deck in the bosun's locker were 2 Lightcore 7200 infrared gas analyzers. So they measure the CO2 mixing ratio using an infrared light and a certain amount of absorption. They can figure out what the actual CO2 mixing ratio is inside the chamber. So we had 2 of those, and gas was being pulled down the mast through them by a pump that was also down below deck. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, what we were really after was gas transfer velocity. We didn't just want to measure the flux, because if you do that, you really don't have any context for why you're measuring what you're measuring. So we wanted K, so we set the measured flux against the bulk formula. We obtained delta P CO2 from a group at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory that were measuring on the ship simultaneously. And solubility was just calculated using the ship's water temperature and salinity values. So the only unknown in the 2 equations was K, which allowed us to get K.
How do you measure the ocean CO2 when it's ice bound?
So we're not measuring what's in the ice, though that would be a really cool future study somehow. But below the ice, so the ship has an intake under the ice, and so because everybody on the ship is doing something with seawater, so they're always pulling seawater in, and there's like a wet lab in the back, and then what you do is you take it and there's multiple ways to do this, but the way I believe it was being done on the ship is a shower head equilibrator, so they'll just
Is the variability of CO2 bigger in the ocean or in the air, or is it they both contribute?
The air is
Like
very small variability.
or time variability?
So the CO2 in the water can change rapidly over spatial distances, but we didn't really see that. So people have measured that. There's a group in England that measured that in the North Atlantic, where they drove, the ship went through like bands of different CO2 in the water. So yeah, you can have quick changes, and then, and you can also have much different, there's a much larger swing. So the ocean can go from like 100 parts per million to, well, the ocean doesn't typically go over 1,000, but you can have these hundreds of parts per million range, whereas the atmosphere doesn't see that unless you're standing next to exhaust. Like,
You sound like doing that too.
what's
Yeah,
it?
warmed up.
It's going to raise another question. I don't know if there's fast enough response instruments for the water itself to measure the CO2 concentration, but could you do any flux under the surface?
Yes, you can, and I don't. So actually, I did that as part of a project during my postdoc in Calgary, but I don't know that people do it with CO2 because I don't know that there's a fast response CO2 sensor yet. But there's an oxygen sensor, and there's a few others. So yeah, people do underwater Eddy covariance. But the reason is, but the fact is, you generally don't have, like PCO2 doesn't change very quickly in the air or the water, usually. Because you usually have a pretty homogeneous water, like amount of water. So you pretty much can expect it to stay consistent. It does change throughout the cruise. I didn't put the plot in here, but it does change, and yeah, anyway. Actually, I did put the plot in. I'll show you in a bit. I forgot that. All right, so you generally, though, over the course of your flux interval, which is only 20 minutes, or 10 minutes in this project is 10 minutes, it's at the bottom, it's not going to change that much in 10 minutes. So you really just need it to be consistent for your flux interval. Okay, so then something else, this is a flow diagram of all the instruments that were in the bosun's locker. I know it's a lot on here, so really I'll just highlight the things that were important. The pump was pulling the air down. The 7200s were the gas analyzers. They were closed path. And then this was the critical component of this project. We dried the air mass before it went to the gas analyzer. So this was in response to the problem that I mentioned earlier of the previous Eddy covariance instrumentation failure, was that these infrared gas analyzers measure both water vapor and CO2 using infrared absorption. There's a little bit of overlap in the bands. So I actually don't know the degree that it matters over forests. I assume it doesn't matter very much because there's really large fluxes. But over the ocean, there are really small fluxes of CO2, and there are really large water vapor fluxes. So that little bit of overlap completely contaminates your CO2 mixing ratio values if you don't dry it. So we dried it using this, it's called a Nafion dryer, and it just exchanged water vapor through like a membrane, but it doesn't exchange CO2. So that was kind of the critical component to this, to improve the fluxes. And then there was a whole set of other things we had to do to take into account that we were going to be in the Southern Ocean and be sailing around Antarctica. So some instrument heating. So it's hard to kind of tell, but this sonic in the foreground has heat tape. So these are red heat tape bands. They were wrapped completely around the sonic, and then it was taped with this mylar reflective tape. That clicked on anytime it was freezing. So that was going to prevent rhyming or ice. And then you can't, it's kind of not super visible, but this behind it is the inlet tube. And that was a heated inlet tube so that we didn't get condensation in the inlet tube and freezing on the ice and the inside walls. So that was kept at a constant temperature of 10 degrees Celsius. And then the other thing we had to contend with being the Southern Ocean was waves. So yeah, we didn't know quite what we were going to deal with, but then the ship's technicians, before we set up, sent us this picture and said, you know, you could be prepared, you know. So the issue here is, well, first off, the sonics don't work when this is happening. So we're going to throw out this period anyway. This one actually, it wasn't installed yet, but we would throw out something like this because it wouldn't have worked. But we needed to make sure we didn't get water into our gas analyzers. So we weren't on the ship. The inlet tube was always pulling air down through the gas analyzers. So we had to figure out a way to protect them. So for this project, I designed this backflush system. So it essentially, there's a water sensor just upstream of the gas analyzer. And it was like $5 just a circuit. And when the salt water runs through the tube, it completes the circuit. And then that sends a signal to a bunch of valves, which switched, closed off the gas analyzers, opened up a path to a compressed air tank, and shot it back out. So I have a video of that we took at the beginning.
So the inlet tube is going down the life force on the Wilson's locker.
Yep.
And you're correlating the fluctuations there with what's happening to sonic anemometer.
Yes.
And there must be some frequency loss.
Yeah, so you can, so that was considered in the design. So we had to pull really fast. So there's a couple ways to do this. Ideally, you want a little distance between the gas analyzer and the sonics, but it wasn't feasible to put them up on bow mast in this project. So we pulled as fast as we could. It was maybe I believe it was about 60 liters per minute, which isn't ridiculously fast because there was some balancing act we had to do with the pressure sensors and stuff. But so 60 liters per minute, and then what you really need to do is you need to make sure you have turbulent flow within the tube lines. So if you have the turbulent flow within the tube lines, you prevent smoothing of the signal. And so, we just used kind of the equations from old papers like Lanchow and stuff. And you can just, based on the tube flow, tube length, tube diameter, you can get it so that it's turbulent. So we had turbulent flow in the tube to prevent that issue.
What's the 7500 here?
That's supposed to get us water vapor flux.
Okay.
And there's a plot of that. It's not very good because it gets salt on it like day 2, and that's game over. But yeah. Okay. So that cup had water in it, and then. Yeah, so this ended up, this thing tripped about 40 to 50 times per cruise. So, I mean, kind of on average once a day. It wouldn't happen once a day, but on average it was once a day. So you hit a big storm and it would happen a few times. That's kind of the setup of how we had to kind of ruggedize the system for the Southern Ocean. As I mentioned earlier, we had some cameras on the ice tower pointed towards the port, forward starboard, and we used those to get estimates for the sea ice concentration. So just orthorectify the image after the fact, and then we used a method where we manually set the threshold visually. So this would be the orthorectified image, and then we'd run through a threshold of different whiteness values until it matched, and then we did that 1 per minute. There were millions of photos, so just did 1 per minute, took the average for the flux interval. Yep, and so that was the setup of the methods. The 2 cruises that I'm going to show you the results from here are up on the screen. The first was from Punta Arenas, Chile to McMurdo Station in Antarctica. And then the second one was from Hobart to Antarctica and then back to Hobart. And the other thing about these ship tracks here is they're colored based on the sea ice concentration. So blue is open water, and then red is complete ice coverage, and then anything in between is mixed sea ice and open water. So the meteorology throughout the cruises, temperature is on the top panels for the 2 cruises, generally below freezing. The seawater was about minus 1.5 the whole time, well, at least once we got out of the middle latitudes. The more important things from the perspective of the CO2 fluxes are wind speed, which is the middle set of panels, and the delta P CO2. So the wind speeds, over the course of the 2 cruises, we got a wide range of different wind speeds, and we got some really large wind speeds here on the second cruise, sometimes breaking 20 meters per second. And then the delta B CO2 on the bottom, so there's a question earlier about what were they. So as we moved, so the issue is if we'd stayed put in one spot, they probably would have stayed the same consistently, but the ship, rode around Antarctica, so we passed through different regions. So at the start of the cruise, pretty much no difference between atmospheric and water concentrations. But then when we got down into the Antarctic sea ice zone, we ended up getting really large delta P CO2s, which is really good. It's what allows you to have enough of a signal for your CO2 flux to actually get a good measurement. So we were down, it almost hit minus 300. So meaning the water was about 100 parts per million, while the atmosphere was around 400. So that was good for the measurement's sake. And the other thing on that bottom plot, and I bring it up because it's on the next set of plots, is blue circles represent open water. The green triangles represent anytime sea ice was present. So this is a summary, 3-hour averages of the 10-minute fluxes for momentum flux, which is the top set of panels, the sensible heat flux on the second set, latent heat third, and the CO2 flux is at the bottom. The top two, so we plotted them against the NOAA core model, and we found pretty good relationship between what the core spit out and what we measured. So for the momentum flux, there was core 3.5 because there had been an update, and then for the sensible heat flux, core 3.0. But essentially, we saw this really good relationship. So that gave us some confidence that the flux system could measure on the bow mast. The latent heat flux, as I mentioned, was not. Well, it didn't match the model, and we don't believe it was good because we looked at the spectra and they looked pretty crappy. And then lastly, on the bottom was the CO2 flux. And the blue is the open water, and I plotted that here against Wanacott 14 parameterization, and got pretty good result or agreement there. And then the green points often did not match, as we would have expected, because they're in the sea ice zone. So later on, I'll just show you the results and what's happening there. But first, I'll just talk about what the open water gas exchange looked like. So this is a plot I showed earlier of gas transfer velocity on the y-axis, 10-meter wind speed on the x-axis, and then the 3 different parameterizations. And then our points on top of that here. And as you can see, it's kind of a noisy data set, but it's way less noisy than what the open paths look like. They're off the charts. They wouldn't even be on. I mean, there would be some on here, but they'd be all over the place. Which I had that data set too, because we had open paths. We had open paths and we had an undried closed path, and they were way more noisy. So this was pretty good. We were pretty happy with that. And then, because it appeared to be an improvement. So the best fit regression through this was a cubic, was a quadratic, excuse me, and it was k is equal to 0.245 times wind speed squared plus 1.3. And what we saw was that we fell almost directly on top of the Wanacott 14 parameterization. So concluded here that that's a pretty reasonable parameterization. If you're going to use it for a model, it actually matched what we saw with our higher frequency, higher spatial resolution data.
It seems like there's enough kind of outliers that are interesting, right?
Yeah, so
things going on there.
So I mean, people will still, this is why there's always going to be people doing this, is because there's way more to pull out of this. And so ideally, like we didn't have a lot of like the other types of measurements we could use to get into, like the ship was moving. There are a lot of questions that people still have of how to like improve this. So people are trying to come up with something better than just wind speed. And we didn't have the capability here, but
What if you plotted it against U-star or something turbulent?
U-star tightens it up, and people like just a year ago or two, there was a new paper that came out and said, hey, this is better, and I kind of feel like, of course it's better because it's got the W prime in it. You've got, it's halfway the same variable to begin with. So anyway, but people think if you can use it, you should use it. If you have U-star, use U-star because you're going to get a tighter relationship. This was actually more for the idea of we need to give something that people are doing carbon budgets based on satellite wind speed values. They need wind speed. I mean, maybe there's U-star.
Yeah, that's right.
What's that? You can do
The
satellite.
satellite stuff is technically also more tightly tied to U-star, but people generally bring it.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, so you're converting it to wind speed and then using wind speed.
Right.
Okay.
Scannerometry is a measure of ocean stress, basically.
Okay, so maybe that is the way to do it. Yeah.
Could the high Ks be because you're sampling the exhaust? Did you clear for?
Yeah, so we.
Sure, you're always ahead of the wind.
Yeah, we cleared for any time the wind was from aft, and it's possible if the ship was doing some maneuvering, like huge maneuvers or something, it's possible that we got some exhaust. But I don't think so because the exhaust shows up pretty clearly, and obviously it would get, certainly, like, I threw out anything, spikes, you know, if you had a spike of CO2, that was a time period you couldn't use. So, but then again, if it had been out there for long enough, yeah, it is possible. But I think it's pretty much not an issue here. Yep.
Forgive a most likely naive question, but motivated by an impression that might be wrong too. It looks to me like the density of data points is vastly larger above the blue line than it is below it. So I'm not sure I understand what the blue line means.
These ones?
Yeah.
Yeah, so one thing, okay, so I'd say probably only over here, right?
I'd say around 10 meters per second too.
Around 10 meters.
Looks like it to me.
Yeah,
but, you know,
mean, the bin average is a little bit above at that spot. Yeah.
So the blue
I don't
lines
know.
are bin averages, so those are,
okay, so there should, that's the line. If you drew a line through all the blue boxes, you'd probably have about an even distribution above and below.
Yeah, because
Not
it
exactly
gets pulled
the
down
same.
at other spots.
Okay,
so.
okay.
But one thing I it didn't seem important enough to throw on here. This was you know, because it's really splitting hairs at the right around the intercept. When we actually put a quadratic through, best fit was actually through 3.3. But the bottom three bins were just a perfect straight line through each other, and they were going through 1.3. So we forced it through 1.3.
Okay.
So it should have been a little higher at the tail. Yeah. And, yeah.
sorry, maybe I can ask you many questions, but do you see any enhancement at low wind speeds? Is that something we see at small lakes where we have convective or superlative transport?
Yeah, well, I mean, even the 3.3, or even the 1.3, I mean, everything else goes through 0. So even that was something, because a lot of the ocean doesn't have very strong wind speeds. So just not having a 0 intercept matters. But I mean, generally, yeah, that's actually reasonably tight. It's not like our craziest, like a lot more noise further out. So yeah, so not a ton, I guess.
Yeah, and just surprised. I feel like, at least when we do like wind speed profiles in terrestrial systems, we also account for stability, right?
Yeah.
Some sort of more Novikov type correction.
Yeah.
That's normally not done in the ocean. The assumption is it's pretty much always near neutral.
Well, I still corrected for, I mean,
Yeah.
did U10 the more Novikov
Oh, okay.
on
So
U10.
U10 is derived.
So it's U10 neutral. Yeah.
Okay. That's hiding it there.
Yeah. Okay, so then onto the sea ice zone results. Yeah, so just recollection or just recall we had the full spectrum of sea ice concentration, so from blue to red here. And before I show the results, just have to define a couple of terms. The fraction of open water is represented as F, and it's just 1 minus the sea ice concentration. And then this value on the right is K sub EFF, that's K effective. That just refers to the K that we measure. So without consideration of what the percentages of sea ice and open water are. So what we measure, and the reason I have a separate value for that is it's to differentiate it from K open water. So the question then is the K that we measure, K effective, is that equal to what we would expect open water to be scaled to the fraction of open water? So if we see 50% open water, 50% ice, do we get kind of 50% gas exchange? So that's kind of what we're looking for. And the model that we tested predicted enhancement, and some other people had measured enhancement, but all of the carbon budgets, they predict linear scaling. Probably out of convenience because nobody had an actual hard number on it if there was enhancement. So they just say it's a straight line, you're going to scale to the fraction of open water. So this is K effective against friction velocity. I did that here because it actually is a tighter, it's actually a better relationship. So this is going to be gas transfer velocity against the friction velocity, and this is for open water points here, but then I'll step down through increasing amounts of sea ice concentration. So when we had 0 to 10% sea ice cover, we saw a little bit of a reduction on average in gas exchange. From 10% to 30% sea ice cover, further still, 30% to 70% in yellow, 70% to 90%, and then 90% to 100% sea ice cover. So we effectively saw gas exchange shut off as sea ice concentration increased. but this isn't usable necessarily for a model, so we thought, all right, another way to show this is a ratio of the K effective, this in the measured K, divided by what we expected open water to be. So we used our open water result to calculate a K open. And this is obviously blank, I just wanted to set it up before I threw a bunch of things on it. So the black line is the one-to-one line, and that represents linear scaling to the fraction of open water. And as I mentioned, carbon budgets, they use that. So this is like the Takahashi values. And then our values on top of that, over here. And then bins. Bins were, on average, right around that line.
So for 100% ice, as you said, the average shuts down.
Yep.
But the individual measurements still show quite wide variations. Is that just measured noise, or where are those large excursions coming from?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have a good explanation for all of them, and probably there's a different explanation each time. Some of it could be we don't have a perfect representation of the sea ice coverage. So I had two cameras, they're pointed kind of like this, and then the flux footprint was out front. So, there are times where probably our measured sea ice concentration doesn't represent the flux footprint. So that's one thing. The other thing is, a lot of the time we were in melt ponds, and melt ponds have a different thing going on. They often are thought to absorb CO2 flux. The other thing with respect to this ratio is that the values are so small that really small differences. You essentially one of these points up here could be that there was next to no gas exchange, but we measured next to no gas exchange, but the ratio it just blows up. So it's not really a good way to measure or to show it, but this is what we thought we needed to do for the ratio, just for the sake of
We see some wild fluxes on our tower on Lake Mendota during ice cover periods that are hard to explain too.
Yeah.
There's some interesting dynamics going on. I mean, there is some exchange through ice, so things can happen.
Yeah.
Have you tested that graph without the lines and the bars on it to see if anybody would have guessed what the one-to-one line is? I mean, honestly, I'm tricking myself into thinking I might have seen it anyway, but I don't know if I would have.
If you would have noticed that this is the one-to-one, you're saying?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I haven't tried that. But
Yeah, up near 1 and around near 0.3, it looks like, there's something around there, but not everywhere. It's kind of interesting.
yeah.
The averages.
Okay, and then just kind of to finish the results up is I took the results from the open water and the sea ice zone, and I did a carbon budget following the same method as Takahashi 2009. So that was his PCO2 inventories for the global ocean and separate analysis data, and then the relationship for open water and linear scaling in the sea ice zone. So I did that for the Southern Ocean. I plotted Takahashi's values, and then I did an enhanced scenario. So what we would have gotten if we used that cubic relationship from before for open water, and what we got when we used the loose 2014 model in the sea ice zone. And so this is it. The CO2 fluxes are on the y-axis, latitude on the x, and then the different subplots are seasons. So what's that? Summer, spring, winter, fall. Right? I got those backwards. Summer, AMJ is fall, winter, spring. Yeah, the Southern Ocean. Okay, so so the plots from this study are the blue circles, black line, Takahashi in green, and then the enhanced scenario in red. And generally, this study showed that it's pretty much very similar to the Takahashi values, and that really just came down to the choice of parameterization for open water because we scale linearly, and then and the enhanced scenario here had often both in the sea ice zone, which is represented by dashed lines, and then this outlines open water. In the sea ice zone and in the open water, the enhanced scenario is about twice as much gas exchange. And then the averages, so these were band averages by latitude, just the whole study area averaged. So this study predicted 1.1 petagrams carbon uptake, Takahashi with 1 petagram carbon uptake, and then the enhanced scenario was predicting 2 petagrams carbon uptake. Yep.
And the enhanced scenario is that original cubic by Weinhoff?
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, and the model for the air sea ice model in the sea ice. So every grid cell was, if there was ice present, I used the ice model.
In one of your original plots, it looked like, I couldn't quite tell, but from Takahashi's data that the northern hemisphere, there was less uptake than in the southern hemisphere, zonally average. And that's sort of different than the calm amount of CO2 in the ocean. Is that okay? Is
this
it,
one you think?
Yeah. Yeah.
What's the question again?
So, say at 40 north, there's some uptake into the ocean, but at 40 south, it's much bigger.
Yeah.
And then if you think of a map like the left-hand one, and instead of, in terms of column amount of CO2, there's a lot more in the North Atlantic at depth, is that right?
What would say, the last thing again? I missed that.
Well,
literally last sentence.
So there's sea surface flux, but
Yeah,
then there's
right.
total column inventory.
Column inventory, okay.
And the North
Okay.
Atlantic, I think, supposedly
Yeah.
twice as much goes in there.
Okay.
But this doesn't.
Well,
say
so
that.
you can see the darkest, the biggest actual spot for uptake is in the North Atlantic here, right? It's darkest,
Yeah.
the most, that's where the magenta is concentrated the most. The issue is this is just, there's just more space in the Southern Ocean. So there's just more grid cells. So when you just, it's just a sum. This is really just sum. So even though the fluxes were huge here, it didn't amount to very much because it's just a small little.
But then would it be true that the Southern Ocean is the site of greater uptake?
Yeah, it's generally.
I guess I just didn't realize that.
In terms of like total amount, yeah, that's the way the
I
literature.
think there's a lot of uncertainty on that because
Yeah.
until recently there weren't a lot of measurements in the Southern Ocean, and
Oh.
so that's really, I think, what a lot of some of the other projects
Actually,
and cruises were focused on.
That's a good point because yes, so I don't know, the Takahashi has this data set of all the ship tracks and they come up with this PCO2 map for the globe, and it's just interpolated, and so in the Southern Ocean there's this really sparse data. So those are the largest uncertainty for PCO2, and that's going to be a huge deal when it comes to a plot like this. So yeah, yep.
And another problem too, that it's like such a complicated circulation that some of like what might be drawn down might not go all the way to the bottom water. It might be like well in like cold water or something like that.
I don't know. It sounds good though.
If we know that like the circulation that well at all exists so
Yeah.
sparse, but I think that's a problem.
So something like that. If the ship didn't, if you didn't have any measurements in this point, you're saying if you hadn't measured it, it wouldn't be incorporated into something like this. Is that the idea?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's just like the longevity of really getting the carbon to get down into the deep ocean and stay there.
Yeah.
Is maybe not as
Oh,
certain
yeah.
as it is in the North Atlantic or other regions. So.
Okay. Yeah.
This may at first glance disagree with the idea of the ocean conveyor belt, but
It's-
it's probably reconcilable.
Why? I guess I'm a little curious why it doesn't. So so you have these fluxes up here, which are often maybe it's drawdown. Like if you have so you might have a lot of you would have really low PCO2 up here, but it could still be just based on I don't know. Because yeah. I don't know.
I don't think it does. Why would this contradict
Well, so, I mean, just the thermohaline circulation goes in the North Atlantic to first order, it comes out after 1,000 years everywhere else. There's a little bit of sprinkling in the Southern Ocean as sort of the canonical viewpoint, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
I was
based
the
on this
Southern
data.
Ocean there's a lot more land in Southern Ocean than anyone thought.
Well, then you're probably right.
I could be wrong, it's been a long time since I.
So there is, so when they do this, so that if you look down here, you have almost no net uptake. And that has to do with the sea ice. So the way that this is modeled generally is like a three-dimensional model. So this would be done, essentially it predicts that there's upwelling and it's bringing carbon-rich water. And so when the ice melts, you have outgassing. So the seasonal flux down in the Southern Ocean is uptake one season that's outgassing after the ice melts. And it ends up being 0 net uptake. So that's really far south. And then I guess you could split hairs over where the difference of the Southern Ocean boundary is, because I've seen a lot of different definitions. But if we're calling all this the Southern Ocean, then yeah, the Southern Ocean has a net uptake. But it could be that there's, I mean, the model, the three-dimensional models still say there's an uptake there, and it still comes out with this lower PCO2 right around Antarctica. Okay, so the kind of just the conclusions here, and then I'll show some pictures. So this was the first unattended eddy covariance system that had been deployed, so it's kind of a proof of concept. There had been one unattended open path system. The results were never published, so I assume they didn't, that was before this. I assume they didn't get anything very good. But the idea was right, which is if you can collect these on ships like, you know, or ships of opportunity, or I forget what they call them, but if you can just put a system on and leave it, you could in theory do what Takahashi did for PCO2, which is get it all over the world and then kind of answer more questions. And then in terms of the science conclusions, we found this quadratic relationship between gas exchange or gas transfer velocity and wind speed in the open ocean. And then in the sea ice zone, we saw the gas exchange scaled linearly to the fraction of open water, or proportionally. So that was this project. Yeah, you know, sometimes I show the results and people go, yeah, of course nothing's going on through the ice. So this one seems intuitive. We kind of thought that was going to be the answer, but yeah, it was the first one to actually get those measurements. So budgeters, carbon budget people have come and been like, great, we finally have something I can cite now. And so, but this led into the next project that I did. I don't know what time is it. Okay, that's all So the next thing I did is I started this postdoc a couple of years ago in Calgary. So I was working with Brent Ellis at the University of Calgary, and he kind of asked me to set up a similar type of project, or similar type of system on an island. It's pretty much just a rock outcrop in the middle of the Canadian Arctic, and on a tower. So some of the advantages here are no motion correction, a lot less flow distortion, and yeah, and the ability to measure in one spot over the course of a year. So get an annual cycle. The problems are that there's no power. So to get this thing powered through the Arctic winter was, well, we didn't succeed yet. But we got a lot of winter data. It just cut out in the middle of January. So the site was up here. This is the Dease Strait. It's just south of Victoria Island in the Arctic. And the tower, same thing, same sonic anemometer, same gas analyzer. Because the whole system for the drying was very power hungry on the ship, we couldn't use it, so we just had to use a huge tank of dryer, right? There's 50 pounds of this desiccant at the bottom, and it just looped through. But the air was pretty dry to begin with, so it actually lasts for like a month or two, and then it would be replaced. Yeah, so that was this one. And so it allowed us to kind of ask some extra questions, or this one we answered before, but this was set out to confirm it. Are there measurable fluxes through like land-fast sea ice, which we hadn't measured on the ship? So in the middle of the winter, are we seeing anything?
Is that the view from the tower?
This is the view from the tower. Yeah.
Did you take that?
No, there's a GoPro.
Okay.
What time of day? I mean,
I have no
are you at
idea.
70 degrees north or higher than that at this place?
I forget. Well, it's probably in the 60s, but it's above the Arctic Circle.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's not too far above the Arctic Circle. But because of that, it's still just rings, so I don't know.
What's that, is that a smaller tower?
Oh yeah, this was just like a little like 2-meter tower, which ended up being used to crank up the big one. So we can the big one's retractable, so we can take it up and down. It's kind of cool.
How do you get? So you're looking for fluxes through sea ice?
Yeah, well, we were just looking for the annual CO2 flux in the spot. So this is all the strait. There is an island out there, but it's several kilometers away. I think it's 3, 5, I actually forget the distance. Yeah, so that was a question we looked at, but it wasn't the main question. The thing that's more, was more interesting was what's happening during melt season. So people have predicted the melt ponds uptake, and not just predicted, people doing chamber measurements have said, okay, you get uptake during melt ponds. The issue with chambers is people have to be there. You can't let it run all year, and you can't, and they often get knocked over, things happen, or they're not representative of the whole flux footprint. So we got to measure through the melt pond season. And then the other one that had never been measured was freezing. So these are this is the ice freezing on the water. So this is really early in the freezing process, and then a couple days later you get the lily pads or the pancakes. Anyway, so yeah, so this was the ability to look at this. And up till this point it had only been theory, and there was a lab study that said, okay, you should get that measured freezing conditions and seeing what they got in a tank, and they saw outgassing. So when sea ice forms, it expels its gases as well as its salts, so you get outgassing. So we ended up actually measuring the outgassing, and so this is the only plot I'll show from this data. This is the first year, most of the first year, because it cut out in January. So red is full ice coverage, blue is open water, and the colors in between are everything in between. So essentially this was starting in April when we set it up, and then when we hit the melt season we got some uptake, and then it switched over to outgassing, and then to uptake. This whole section we believe just to be temperature dependent. So as the temperature of the water changes throughout the season, it changes the PCO2 in the water. That's just a physical change. And then when it started to freeze again, that uptake based on the water was counteracted by the outgassing from the freezing, and then we had this little band of freezing there. So right now this stuff is being worked up in a paper. There's a methods paper on it, but there's the actual science papers being worked on, and there's some other people who are measuring biological communities in water and current, and so it's all getting put together. Yeah, so this is that project, and yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Any other questions? Discussion?
Yeah.
Yeah, so your third conclusion, on one hand, was intuitive and convenient, and that the exchange is proportional to the fraction of open water.
Yeah.
At the same time, to me, it seemed a little counterintuitive, because I would have expected things like the roughness of the water and breaking of waves and foam and things like that would play a much bigger role in the fluxes.
Wait, say it's like the foam in. So we didn't.
In open water, you expect more breaking waves and foam,
Yeah,
and
so
you would think that would enhance.
yeah, that's a good point.
Use that with the ice cup.
Yeah, so actually, I'm not convinced that the reason we got didn't need to go all the way through. I'm not convinced the reason we got this is because it's the same physics. I think you're probably getting. You're probably getting, yeah, so the stuff that the model predicts for enhancement probably is happening to some degree. Form drag, the ice is moving through the water. There is melting or freezing effects, salt expulsion, all sorts of things that are going to affect the water side turbulence. I think that's probably happening. But the thing you lose in the sea ice zone is it gets dead still. So there's no waves, unless sometimes a big wind will come up and it'll create little capillary waves on the surface. But you're getting rid of maybe one of the big players there. So I think maybe you're getting a balancing act.
Was that near where the Franklin expedition ended up, or some people got that far south? Is that sort of kind of scary?
Wait, say that again?
The Franklin expedition, it was like after 3 years they all died.
Yeah, and then they found him in the ice, right? Yeah.
Was that in the Antarctic?
No, that was
No,
it was in the archipelago. Yeah,
Okay.
Cambridge Island. Or
Yeah.
I was wondering if you found
It
any
might have been right
artifacts.
there. Yeah. I didn't see any. There was a ship. I don't have a picture of it. There was a stranded ship there, but I don't think it was Franklin's. It's called the Maud, and it was still there. It actually just was in the news because they Finland or Sweden wanted it back, and so they mailed this ship. It was really cool looking. It was a 100-year-old ship just sitting in Canada.
Cool.
All right, thanks for coming.
That's a fascinating job. It's great to have some more ocean back in AOS.
Yeah, that's great.
Thanks.